Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I would like to talk about how I think you should practice for a tournament if you are trying to win the whole thing, and how to build an army list that is capable of winning that tournament. Based off of my recent success at the TBMC ITC GT, I am confident that the way I practiced and the way that I built my list helped me improve myself and my army at a quick pace that allowed me to be prepared for the meta. So I will try to explain how I build for the tournament and how I practiced for the event, and also alternative ways to practice that aren't as optimal but still help just in case you don't have the time or available opponents to practice how I did. Before we get into the topic for this video though, this video was brought to you by themagnetbaron.com. They sell modeling magnets for all sizes, they sell magnetized flight stands, they have magnets for magnetized army trays, and even offer custom pre-built and magnetized models, all for a great price. So if you're looking for anything magnet related for your hobby, then check out themagnetbaron.com. The link is in the description. So for those of you who don't know, before I got into Warhammer 40k, I was heavily into competitive card games, with Yu-Gi-Oh being the big one. So I took the way that most competitive card players practice for tournaments and adopted it for Warhammer 40k. This method requires a few things though. It requires you to be able to play 2 to 5 times a week, and requires you to know people that play all of the Meta Armies or own the game Tabletop Simulator. So that way you can look for people online who play the Meta Armies and play them on Tabletop Simulator. For those of you who are unaware of Tabletop Simulator, it's a game on Steam that allows you to play actual games of Warhammer 40k with mods. And I even have a guide video on how to install and play with mods, and I will put a link for it in the description. If you can't find the time to play more than 2 games a week, then there's still hope, and it's still possible to do well, but the more practice the better. So let's get into the steps I took when practicing that helped me get better prepared for the GT that I attended. Step 1. I studied the meta to determine which armies I thought I was going to face at the tournament and which ones would give me a hard time. I did this by subscribing to the Best Coast Pairings app and looking up all of the armies that have been doing well for the past 2 months. I already do this for you by posting the top 10 armies every month, so you can watch the most recent videos and then combine that with looking up the most recent events from the month that you're currently in on Best Coast Pairings. And when you're looking at Best Coast Pairings, I would look at the top 6, 8, or 16 based off of how big the tournament was. So make a list of how many times each army pops up, and that will help you determine which armies you will have to look out for and try to counter with your build, which leads into the next step. Step 2. Choose an army and build a list that has good matchups or directly counters the majority of the meta armies. If your list can do well against the meta armies, then you're probably going to do well naturally against the weaker non-meta armies, so I would really only consider the meta armies when building a list. This step requires you to have a lot of game knowledge and understanding of the game in general. If you don't have a good enough understanding of the game, you can always talk to more experienced players for help like myself. I do offer a list building service through my Patreon, where I will build you a list to do well in the current meta, or I can doctor your list to help it do better in the current meta. Or you can ask people who play meta armies what they struggle against and try to make decisions based off of that. But again, that requires a little bit of game knowledge and lots of trial and error, and also knowing someone that plays the meta armies. Step 3. Message everyone you know who has a meta army so that you can practice against them. Prioritize the people who play the meta armies that you don't normally have a chance to face, because that will mean that you're not that versed in them and you need more practice against them. So say if you have a friend that plays Tyranids and you're always playing against Tyranids, you probably don't need that much more practice against Tyranids because you already know how that matchup goes. So instead, try to message the guy that plays Eldar or Necrons or one of the other meta armies that you haven't really played that much and don't necessarily know that much about. So make plans with these people and schedule games throughout the week or the weekend. Let them know you're trying to practice for a tournament and that you appreciate all the help you can get. When I did this step, I played about 3 to 5 times a week for about 6 weeks. And when I did get together with my opponents, I tried to get in at least 2 games against their army for reasons I will explain in another step. You can get away with playing twice a week at minimum, but I would recommend to try and play as much as possible so that you can see as many interactions as possible, so that if those situations arise in a tournament, you know how to deal with them and you're prepared for them. If you naturally play a lot, then you may not need as many games either. If you've been practicing with the same list and army for months already and have already attended events with that list, you can pretty much skip this step or just play the minimum amount of games so you don't get rusty. This step is mainly for people who haven't practiced in a while or are learning a new army or building a new list or learning how to pilot their lists against the meta armies. Step 4. Play the games with your opponents that you scheduled matches with. and try to play at least 2 games with each person for a couple of reasons. During game 1, you deploy as normal and follow the rules for how to determine missions and deployment, and then start your game. During that game, you should allow some things to fly that you wouldn't normally in a regular game or a tournament game. For example, let's say you're playing against Blood Angels and they deep strike a unit of Death Company in, but they unluckily fail their 3d6 charge, which is not something that normally happens. I think you should let them re-roll it until they get into combat. Now hear me out, I know this sounds counterintuitive, but when something like that happens, the chances and the statistics are that it's most likely going to happen. So practicing with your opponent having bad luck just means that you're not practicing at the level you should be, because you always assume that your opponent is going to have good luck. So if you're going to a tournament and you've only practiced against people that have had bad luck, then you're not going to be ready for when that one guy just rolls everything he needs to and has the best luck in the game. Which might not happen, but it could happen. So you have to be prepared for it. So like another good example of this is if you're playing against someone using Celestine and they roll a 1 for her to get back up from the dead. Statistically, she's almost always going to get back up from the dead. So when they do roll that 1, let them re-roll it for free or just pretend they rolled anything but a 1, because it's more statistical that she would have normally lived. This way you can prepare yourself for things that will most likely happen at a tournament, instead of relying on your opponent to have bad luck in order to win the game. Another way to do this is also to allow your opponent to shoot with a unit they may have forgot of in their shooting phase. But if you forget about shooting a unit in your shooting phase, don't allow yourself to do it. This way you can theoretically be playing against an opponent that's at their best while you're not. So it pushes you to not forget next time so that you can be playing at your best as well. Also, the people you might be practicing against might not be the most tactical players in the world, and they might not be that competitive of players either. So give them some advantages to boost them up and force you to have to play better overall in order to overcome it. It's basically like putting more weights on your dumbbell. You're just making it a little bit harder for you so you get better training out of it. The reason I say to play 2 games with each opponent is because it will allow you to try different things that didn't happen in the first game. So that way you can see more situations that arise, and that way you can learn about them and know how to deal with them in future games. For example, if you went first in game 1, then allow your opponent to go first in game 2. Don't tell them ahead of time. You can even still roll off, and if you win, just give them first turn and explain why. Or if you went second and still won the game during the first game, you can purposely switch up the type of deployment zone to play so that you can practice your army in a different way. For example, if you played in a short-range deployment like Dawn of War for your game 1, then maybe play Hammer and Anvil against them in your second game to test how your army does in a long-range deployment. Because I can assure you, there are some armies that do extremely well in short-range deployments, but struggle very hard in long-range deployments, and you should be prepared for both, and also know how your army does in both. And by the way, if your army seems to auto-lose just because it gets a certain deployment type, you should probably rebuild your army. So because this step was pretty long, let's summarize it real quick. Play against all your opponents. Let your opponents get minor advantages as long as the statistics were in their favor. So like if Celestine rolled a 1 to get up, let her get up anyways, because she most likely would have. If your opponent forgets their shooting in their shooting phase, then you allow them to do it. But if you forget your shooting in your shooting phase, don't you do it. And again, this is just practice for a tournament. Do not play a tournament like this. You do not want to give your opponent any benefit of the doubt or allow them to re-roll for Celestine or just get Celestine up for free. This is only during practice. Step 5. Make adjustments to the list based off of your games. I wouldn't go too overboard with this though. Try to stick to the main game plan you originally had when building the list and just make minor adjustments. The easiest way for me to explain how to do this is how I adjusted my list for the GT I attended. So for those of you who don't know the list I used to play second at the GT, I have a video where I talk about the list and my strategies I used. I'll put a link in the description for those who are interested, and also so that you can see the list to understand what I'm trying to talk about. Just in case you guys haven't clicked on that link to watch that video as well, I played Dark Eldar with Eldar allies in my list that I brought to the GT. So in my first iteration of the list, I had 2 Warlock Skyrunners instead of just 1. The reason being is because I thought I would need a spell called Reveal, which cancels out the cover bonus that enemy units get. In theory, it was great, but after 3 or 4 practice games, I noticed I was hardly ever using the spell. The times I did use it, it was overkill because I already had Jinx and Doom. So I removed 1 Warlock because of this. I also had a unit of Scourges in my original list because I wanted them as some reinforcements for turn 2 or 3 in order to help pick off a unit, or so they can drop on an objective I need and hold it for me. In practice though, they never really did much against the enemy. I think Scourges are great for picking off a unit, but I think it would be better to bring like 3 units or none. So I opted for none since I wanted the points for other things in my list. And when it came to objective holding, I never really needed them. I'd usually drop off a Lamian or some Cabalites or an Archon or even a Venom to sit on the objective and never use the Scourges for that at all. If I did drop the Scourges on the objective, it was a waste of points, and to be honest, I'd rather just use a Venom or Cabalites to sit on the objective because they have a much longer range and can contribute to the game with damage as well while still being on the objective. So because of this, I took the Scourges out. I noticed in like the first 5-ish games that I played that my one Razorwing Jet Fighter was doing amazing and putting in some work and usually never died. So because of this, I added a second Razorwing Jet Fighter and discovered how easy it was to get behind enemy lines and recon for them. So in the next few games of practice with them, it turned out that they were amazing, so I kept 2. I had to remove 1 Venom with this as well to get the points for it, but I think it was worth it overall because the Jet Fighters put in a lot of work and helped me win games with those secondaries. So basically, a lot of trial and error and seeing what works and what doesn't. Add more of what works and take out what doesn't. But keep in mind, if something doesn't work in one game, don't immediately trade it out. Try it a few more times and get a better representation of how the unit will work overall. I'd say try a list 3 or 4 times before making any changes, and only change a few things at a time so it's easier to spot what is working and what isn't. And that's basically the final step of how I practice to build for the TBMC ITC GT. Like I said earlier, these steps that I took for practice helped me a lot, and I probably wouldn't have done well at the tournament without them. And when I go into future events with a new list, I'm going to practice the same way. This type of practice works when you're learning a new army or building a new list, or if the meta has had significant changes since the last time you've practiced. Because if it hasn't changed at all, then as long as you followed these steps at least once, you should be able to get away with just playing once or twice a week, so that way you just don't get rusty. So let's quickly get into other ways to prepare for a tournament if you don't have enough time to play more than once a week, or if you don't know people who play the Meta Armies, or you don't have a computer for Tabletop Simulator. The best way I can think of that you can practice would be to try to study all of the meta codexes if you have access to them, so that you can try to figure out how to theoretically counter them. It might not work in practice, but it's better than nothing. And this also requires a good amount of game knowledge. And again, if you don't think you have enough game knowledge to build your own list or to counter Meta Armies, you can skip this option by purchasing my list building service through Patreon, and I will build you a list myself that is good in this meta or any future meta based off of the army you choose. I can also give you tips on what to look out for and how to play against certain armies. It's basically mini coaching. If you don't want to purchase the service, then you can talk to other experienced players and get their advice either in person at your local gaming store or online through websites like the competitive Warhammer subreddit. I'll put a link down in the description for the subreddit in case that sounds like something that would interest you. The other easy way to practice is to just play against your buddies whenever you get the chance. This isn't the most optimal way to practice because they might not have all the meta armies, and practicing against the same army over and over again will make you really good in that matchup, but if you play against anything else you haven't seen before, then you're going to get a lot of surprises, and anything that catches you off guard in this game probably means you're going to lose. I've noticed the more you're caught off guard and the more you're like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing, the bigger of a chance you have at losing that game because you weren't prepared for it, so you weren't able to deploy properly or move properly in order to counter whatever it is that's now surprising the crap out of you. Which is something I'm going to talk about in a future video about how brand new lists end up doing better than other lists. But that again is a topic for another video. So if you don't have the time to practice against all the meta armies, or if you don't have everyone to practice against, then you can either read all the codexes if you can find access to them in one way or another, or you can play against your buddy over and over again and just hope for the best. Maybe your buddy has a couple of different armies, maybe he can proxy some of the armies, and you can practice against them that way. Again, that's not the best because your buddy doesn't main those armies, so he's not going to know all the ins and outs, but it's still better than nothing, right? So that about covers everything for this video. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more Warhammer 40k content. Don't forget to hit that bell icon so that you're notified when I post new videos. And if you want to help support the channel even further, or if you want to check out the list building service, you can do so on my Patreon. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Happy wargaming.